Once you have it, you know, some slides are somebody has someone who will say like, oh,
It's like having cats. I don't usually listen to this a lot. It's more like podcast, but it's also like that different people and it's just I don't know. It's not really podcast. It's like this is
it needs to be some of the, it's like multi-lines and it's
yes.
Podcast. Yeah, right, Margaret's. Yeah. Oh, it's right next to Malcolm Gladwell. I'm so upset right now. Probably have this kind of seven. Margaret. Is it family?
I like
That's very cute.
Cool. So
I'm sure I can make it. I'm glad you did. I saw you messing with my So I made stuff. Coming to share it with you, at least,
which I'll have some more.
So I guess, yeah, that sounds about right.
If you're doing that, I should probably read a shorter piece now.
I basically don't know. Yeah, it was stuff like that.
Seven. Won't be getting a book today, unfortunately, but prioritize not. Yeah, they should be prioritizing not getting the book. Just putting the live stream up now, and then we'll get started. And of course, what's your you have wait, would you have your Twitter handle Magpie Killjoy? Amazing.
Yeah, and so I made some special eggs and salad and some I see.
I don't know.
It's very simple, not as many spices.
There's a lot of.
And mine are they them. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. I tend to cook like canned. Yeah, it's not that I can
Formally,
I
use she, they, but she is my preference. That is cool.
That's by default too, when I don't have time to think.
Good to know. It's a little warm up here too. I'm gonna turn the AC.
I see like dinner. Aaron's like Sunday when I was yeah, it was a really good. I got to see them, which is the first scene. It was also my friend Mike's birthday. So I went after him. Yeah. But also how does this compare to the RSVPs?
Put that on par.
And I had a younger one. Nice. Yeah, I thought that was great.
You know, on
And a lot of bad shots.
yes.
We went to, oh, that's also awesome, right? I love the way you yeah.
So there's sociology, that's why
Yeah. It's a party, that's like right on. That's awesome. Yeah, people with like stereo systems, they're carrying along, costume. What? That's the stuff. So pretty close to touching.
I guess, I don't think they built those. They had.
There's not a great job. Yeah, so that was all that was only like.
Well, I worked there. I was a kid, I didn't watch that.
Yeah, sometimes it's like I have. Right now. And yeah, my future is that's what I was wondering about. Yeah, and like there's a point at which. Last year, I knew that fast you had.
It's fun weird there because one of
That's right. That was because it turns out not to be that.
where everybody had
I had to explain this. So yeah. Yep. So you know that. And so because I actually been past like one job. So very good. And I said, hey, like, it's like, okay, cool. By the way, also this. And it was a link, like some minimal thing that actually. But I didn't realize which has to be the bottom for like support. Oh, yep. So I thought it was. Yeah. Not that it was a bad job, but just because
This was the. Just really.
It's like now. It's like. Yeah, it was not. It was just like whatever. Right.
Yeah.
I only thought about it. Which one is it? It's super slow to see. Oh, the one at the yeah. Yes. I think now this is going to be a hard weekend to make that work. You know that I think it's tonight. We're missing the
Good evening, everyone. This is not on.
Good evening.
Sha-la-la-la. Well, you can hear me, right? Hello, my name is Shady Rose. I am the events manager here at Lost City Books. I'm very pleased to have you with us. And I just ran up the stairs so I didn't catch my breath. Welcome. Thank you all for making the journey to come out here. There are a few more seats up front for those of you who are just arriving. And we can have some more chairs brought up as necessary. A few things before we get started. The first is that This event is being live streamed, just so you know. And though none of you are visible, at the end, we do have time for a Q&A. So if you ask a question, your question will be on the recording. So just be aware of that. Nextly, please silence your cell phones out of respect to our speaker tonight. We want to hear all the lovely things that she has to say. And those things can be really loud in a space like this. Lastly, with my greatest apologies, unfortunately, we are almost out of the books. So for those of you who ordered ahead of time via Eventbrite, you might want to come and see me because we accidentally ran out of the books more than were sold. That's all on my fault, but it's a good thing. So very nicely done, Margaret.
All of them.
Well, if it was a marketing ploy, it worked. Here we are, back in action. For those of you who are brand new, we are Lost City Books, a used, new, and rare bookstore. So if you have a chance to look around, you'll notice that our shelves are really tightly packed with a lot of awesome, very carefully chosen books, to which we are proud to add, We Won't Be Here Tomorrow. A little bit more about our author tonight. Margaret Killjoy is a trans feminine author born and raised in Maryland who has spent her adult life traveling with no fixed home. Very cool. In 2015 graduate of Clarion West, Margaret's short fiction has been published by Tor.com, Strange Horizons, Vice's Terraform, and Fireside Fiction, among others. She is the author of A Country of Ghosts, The Lamb Will Slaughter the Lion, and The Barrow Will Send What It May. She's also the host of the podcasts Live Like the World is Dying and Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff on iHeartRadio. And now, of course, the author of We Won't Be Here Tomorrow. Everyone, please welcome Margaret Killjoy. I'm wearing a lot of hats, so now I'm going to get in my chair. Hello. Hi, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah.
And for sharing your work with us. I'm really excited to talk about We Won't Be Here Tomorrow. As a huge fan of speculative fiction and of short stories myself, I'm really interested in sort of what is this book about? What does it mean to you to have these specific stories collected together?
So I sort of cheated in when I picked the books, the stories that would be in this book, and that I kind of picked most of them. I picked most of the stories that I've written since 2015 or so, basically like kind of when I started writing at a more professional level. It's not all of them since then, but it's most of them, and then kind of they're accidentally themed because I tend to write stories about those same themes.
So what are those themes? Let's talk a little bit more about kind of what lives at the heart of each of these stories. You say that you kind of accidentally picked them and that they were just most of the stories that you've written since then.
Yeah.
But the through line is not accidental and it comes from somewhere. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that major through line is and how it appears in these stories?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it's in the title, right? We Won't Be Here Tomorrow is the name of one of the stories in it, which is about a group of people who promise to die by the time they're 30. The characters turn 30 and it's like, oh no, I'm in trouble. The ghouls are after me. But I kind of feel like it's a bit of a cheat out, but I was in the catacombs in Paris and my friend who speaks French was translating the poetry on the wall, and there's all this, I don't know, 17th century, 17th century poetry, and all of it is like, hold on to the flowers for soon they will rot and we will die. And I was like, I think all poetry just means YOLO. And I think that that's kind of the central theme of this book is, you know, how many different ways can I come up with in the word YOLO and fancy. Yeah.
It's funny that you say that because when YOLO was a big thing among the teens, maybe a decade ago or so, you know, it just irked the crap out of me when you know, I had a friend who like jumped off the top of the stairwell, YOLO, and like cracked his head open, stuff like that, and then I swear this is relevant. And later, you know, I kind of sat down and thought about what it really means. You only live once, and it's kind of hit me. And I'm like, damn it, is this my life philosophy now? Just do everything as if you might die the next second. So not to overinterpret what you're saying by that, but that's kind of what that made me think of. So let's talk about some of your character work and some of the different characters that appear in these stories. I know that a lot of the work of speculative fiction, especially, is to kind of bring out a lot of selfness in the characters and explore things that you're facing within yourself with characters, especially with short stories. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your characters and how much of you they draw out, or how much of the people around you they draw out, and what that means to work with.
Sometimes my characters are like pretty transparent self-inserts, right? Whenever there's like the hitchhiking trans girl or whatever, the Danielle Kane series that I did is fairly transparent self-insert. I like changed a couple things, like she eats meat and I don't eat meat. It's a huge difference. Has a different name than me. But a lot of the short story work I do, it's less about it being a self-insert and more like I really like writing characters, because the main way that I come up with a story is you have an idea for a setting and maybe a conflict, and then you create all your little wind-up toys of characters, and then you wind them up and then you let them bash their heads into the weird thing that you've constructed. And that's not as much fun if it's just me as the wind-up character over and over again. But I do fairly consciously write about the sorts of people that I'm around and the sorts of people that I know. And so there's a lot of like queer characters, a lot of people living at the outskirts of society. And that's very conscious. It's conscious for a couple of reasons. One is that I don't think we're portrayed very much in fiction. And when we are, we're portrayed in very like cliched ways. And we're rarely protagonized, right? And so I want to make more of my friends protagonists. And then also it's because like, well, it's easier. It'd be harder for me to write someone who doesn't live at the outskirts of society, because I am slightly less familiar.
Absolutely. But that makes a lot of sense. And you're definitely correct about how those who live on margins and who exist on margins are rarely given the center of the story. And thankfully, thanks to authors like yourself and other wonderful people who are emerging, we're seeing so many more of our stories front and center and told by us. So I'm curious a little bit more about sort of, I mean, like you said, it would not make sense to write about, I don't know, Joe Schmo who works at Amazon, and I don't know, that's a bad example. Sorry to anyone who works at Amazon. But just sort of tell me a little bit more about drawing these stories out from the margins and how that kind of developed over the years, whether or not it was just kind of, this is obviously the story that I'm going to tell, or if it came more to you as like, I have all of these stories surrounding me, how do I capture them? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. It's more the latter. I remember the first novella I wrote that I wrote when I was like 20 or something, and it's there's copies floating around somewhere, but I'm not going to tell you what it is or what name I wrote it under. And I wrote it because I was like, I kind of wanted to write memoir, and then I felt a little bit, and I don't want to make this as a statement against writing memoir, but it's where I was at the time, where I was like, I don't want to tell other people's stories for them. And so I didn't want to necessarily, because especially since a lot of what was interesting about my life was the sort of lives of the people that I was interconnected with, right? And so, and people get really understandably upset when they see themselves represented like directly, like, this is you, look, I wrote you. And I'm like, that's not my experience of what happened, And so rather than write memoir, I wrote fan fiction about my life. Like I wrote like basically like I scrubbed off all the names and changed what city it was taking place in or something, And so that was kind of where I first started. And I no longer have that same feeling about memoir. Now I'm a little bit on the like, well, if you wanted to be written about nicely, you could have been nicer or whatever. But actually I feel still very complicated about it. But I'm basically giving myself an out where it would be okay if I did eventually write memoir. I'm not like on the record saying it's bad or something. But yeah, no, and so just when I have a like idea for a story and I pick the characters, it's gonna be characters like when I first started writing, it would be fairly transparently. Like I actually, called one of my friends and was like, hey, I have this character I really want to write. It's basically you, but if you were fighting a demon deer, is that okay? And he was like, yeah, a good character, right? And I was like, yeah, good character. And he's like, yeah, okay. you know, and the character Doomsday in no Thursday in The Lamb Will Slaughter the Lion is based on someone. But then as I the longer I write, the further removed that becomes. I'm less consciously doing a like, what would this person do in this situation?
That makes a lot of sense. You kind of develop sort of drawing smaller and smaller pieces out from your surroundings, and the puzzle of the character becomes larger and more complex the smaller the pieces that you seem to be drawing in. That's my read on what you've just said anyway.
No, that sounds right. That sounds better than I put it. Yeah, I'll use that. That's my answer.
Well, take it for free, please. So I know that you have your 2 podcasts as well, and I think at least some people are here because they're fans of the podcast.
Mhm.
So I wonder, how does your literary life kind of link to your podcast life, and how do they end up interacting as well?
That's the saddest way they interact is that now I have to write about 10,000 words every week about history, about some topic that I've never heard of until I start that week. So I don't have as much time to write fiction, but it's a very different style of writing, and I enjoy both quite a bit, and I look forward to kind of continuing to live a life where I get to do both. And one of the things that's really exciting to me is I feel like I have a greater sense of like larger scopes of history than I did before, and like the way that not just like 3 characters dealing with a thing, but maybe like 3 different societies dealing with a thing might act now that I've spent more time looking at history. And I'm looking forward to writing like fuck off epic like fantasy or something based on being like, oh, I have a better understanding of how, because I really believe that like one of the reasons I haven't written like fuck off epic fantasy is that like I don't want to write based on other fantasy I've read. I feel like it behooves us as genre fiction authors to base our characters and our interactions more on people we know or things that we've witnessed, rather than just drawing on fiction, because then we get further and further away from people actually act, the more we like rely on like, oh, well, this is what this epic person did in this novel did, so that's what my character is going to do, you know.
Absolutely, and I for one am a big fan of fuck off epic fantasy, so please, please fill in that hole in my life. But that's a really interesting development that you just talked about, where you're able to kind of zoom out through having studied history and kind of write at the larger scale, at the sort of societal scale in more ways. So I wonder if, so sorry to maybe rephrase and simplify my question before I go off the rails here, but I'm wondering about how much of that we've been able to see in We Won't Be Here Tomorrow. I know they're short stories, but in a way that zoom out can find its way in short stories as well. And I'm also curious about sort of some of the responses that you've had, both from your readers who are faithful readers of your writing, but also I'm sure people who listen to your podcast also read your works. So I wonder what the crossover is like there and how they interact.
I was so nervous about it because like at doing these events, probably 2/3 of the people in the audience at any given point, I don't mean to make assumptions about you all, but my podcast is substantially more known than my fiction. I've been doing fiction a lot longer, but that's just like the way it goes with podcasting. I was talking to one of my other friends who's a podcaster and a comedian, and I was like, what's it like to be known only for your podcast? And she's like, it's fine. It's totally fine. It's the thing that I've dedicated my life to that I do. And you know, that's just mediums interact with people in different ways. And right now podcasting is a good medium to interact with large audience. But I have been really lucky because I do a whole lot of different things, right? And I have my entire life, I've just been like, oh, well, and I used to be really bad at all of them. And now finally, you know, I'm about to turn 40, and I feel like I'm finally like starting to get good at more of them. And so I was always expecting, because I think people kind of on some level subconsciously think that someone who's good at one thing isn't good at other things. And so like a lot of people like, and I've done this, right, where like my favorite songwriter will put out a novel and I'll be like, but that's not very good. I'm like, it's really good. I'm not gonna embarrass myself in front of the internet. If I wasn't being live streamed, I'd tell you who I'm talking about. He follows me on Twitter. And so, you know, I was really nervous about that. I was nervous how people would respond because it is a very different medium, but I do think that people are overall responding well to it. And I think that, I mean, I've probably always had a sort of nerdy audience. And so being like, oh, and here's the part with the lesbian mermaid who eats people or whatever. And you're like, okay, it's chill. So yeah, so far so good.
Awesome. Cheers to the lesbian mermaid who eats people. Definitely date. Awesome. Well, I think I'd love to hear you read a selection from the book if you're willing to do that right now.
Yeah, I will read a story that actually is the last story in the book, and it's one that I stole from my dad. He's not here, but a bunch of the rest of my family is here. And so I'm going to read one that is actually a little bit less of everything I just said about like people like thrift or whatever, but that's about a witch in the woods, and it's a retelling of a story that my dad told me. I actually don't know if I can read into the mic. Can I just read like this? Is that going to be okay? Everyone? Okay, cool. It's very hard to hold a microphone in a book. This story is called The 37 Marble Steps. I grew up near the foothills of Appalachia, and there's something to these forests. The trees themselves aren't old, but the mountains are old. The mountains are old and battered and smoothed over, and what is a forest but the outbursting of life come up from the land? The trees themselves are not old, but the forests are old because these mountains are old. I grew up near the foothills of Appalachia, and I remember when the Blair Witch Project came out, set close to where I lived, it didn't surprise anyone. Like, yeah, the movie is a work of fiction, but there's still something to these mountains and these forests. There's still something there, something that the movie drew from. My father told me this story when I was a kid. He told me this story under the boughs and the stars, and it's not something I'll ever forget. The next day, he took me to the place it happened. He took me to the marble steps. There are 37 marble steps in the middle of the forest, far from any road. The steps climb steep and twisted up from a seasonal creek, up to a tiny concrete foundation peppered with stones. There's no house there anymore. There is, however, a crack in the foundation. The crack is narrow and long, and underneath there's nothing. Not soil, not rock, just nothing. You shine your flashlight through that crack and you see nothing. You slide your skinny arm through that crack and you feel nothing. You drop a coin through that crack and you hear nothing. I tried all those things. There was a house on that foundation years ago, years before my father was born, probably before his mother was born, maybe before her mother came from the old country fleeing persecution. I couldn't tell you when exactly there was a house on that foundation. It doesn't make sense for there to have ever been one, not out where there's no road, not out where whoever built it had to carry marble and concrete on their back or the backs of animals. I can't tell you why there was a house. I can only tell you that there was one. I can tell you about the woman who lived there too. I can tell you that she didn't have a name, but she didn't need a name. Names are not for yourself, they're for other people. You live alone in a house in the woods at the top of the marble steps, and you don't need a name because no one calls you anything. The people from the nearby town, they just called her the woman who lived in the woods. The woman lived alone, and she was ageless, like all women who live alone. She lived only 5 miles or so from that nearby town. That town is gone now too. It probably had a name, though I don't know it. The woman lived close enough that people hiking or hunting in the forest saw the smoke from her chimney and saw some of the light from her windows. Sometimes people even saw her herself wandering the forest. They saw her hair pinned up in a bun in the summer and under hats and hoods in the winter. They saw her gaze alternatively blank and fierce. Sometimes they heard her sing. It went like this. She walked paths through the woods, sometimes even down to the road alongside town. She had a stick in one hand, a burlap sack in the other. Bad man, braise the bones, she sang as she beat bushes with a stick. A good whack, a good thump against the branches. Bugbear, boil the broth. Animals, all kinds of animals, would run out from the bushes and the brambles right into her sack. Rabbits, groundhogs, snakes, possums, raccoons, mice, birds, and lizards. Every creature under the sun and every creature that hides from the sun would run right towards her and into that sack. Once it was good and full, She'd twist the end closed, lift it like it weighed nothing, and beat the bag with a stick until the squirming stopped and the crying stopped and everything inside was dead or willing to pretend. She'd throw that bag over her shoulder and walk away, whistling now instead of singing. That same tune. I know the tune, I could hum it to you, but I don't know how to write it. So maybe that tune will die out one day, and maybe we'll all be the safer when it does. Dogs went missing around that town. Cats, too. Lambs and calves and chickens. Never children. One reason people in the town put up with that woman as long as they did is that whenever a kid went missing, they'd wind up back at home right in their crib, not crying, the blood of berries tinting their lips. One day, a little girl, not yet 7 years old, got swept away by the river. Surely she'd drowned, the parents thought, the whole town thought. That night, she walked up to her own house wearing a burlap dress, her hair brushed and braided, her belly full. She didn't say a word about what happened, but everyone knew that the lady with the bag and the stick was watching out. It went like that for generations. Was it the same woman? No one could tell. Bruno, Bruno, bake the bread, she sang. Boatman, baste the bear. Good whack, a good thump, and she had the animals, and off she went on her way. Never said a word to a soul. This was fine, and this was good, and no one in town thought too hard on it. Until one day, it wasn't fine, it wasn't good. People mostly want to let each other alone, and that woman wasn't hurting anyone. A boy came up in that town, and he became a man while he was at school in a nearby city. And when he came back as a man, he decided he wasn't going to be the sort to just let people alone. John was his name, at least as I have it. Big John, they called him, because there's an awful lot of Johns, and John was the tallest. One day in early March, John was walking home from the mill. The sun was near to set, and the wind was something wild, and a little bit of snow was being thrown here and there. He saw the woman, and he heard the woman, and he saw a cat run into her bag, and he decided enough was enough. He waited until she was far enough distant, and then he followed her off through the woods, up to that seasonal creek. Most people, they took one look at that house at the top of those marble steps, perched down over the gully, and they went right back the way they came. Big John, though, he waited until the woman went into the house. Then he climbed each of those steps himself. Smoke was pouring out the chimney, and the lamplight flickered through the unshuttered windows, and Big John went up to one of those windows and looked inside. The woman was there, and she had the sack over one shoulder, and she went up to the middle of the bare concrete floor, and she tapped her stick 7 times. Tap, 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 tap. She tapped her stick 7 times, and she stepped back and she waited, and a trap door was there where nothing had been. And she reached down and grabbed the iron rung and pulled it up, and Big John heard a wailing, a keening from within. He couldn't describe it better than that in all the years he tried. Inhuman, inanimal, demonic. The woman upended the sack. Animals, including that cat, tumbled out into the darkness. Soon after, far worse sounds came from that trapdoor, and the woman smiled and cooed like she was tending a pet, and she closed that trapdoor. She tapped on it 7 times with her stick. Tap, 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 tap. The trapdoor was gone. On the wall, hung up with coats and the cloaks, were animal collars and tags, dozens of them. Big John had seen enough, and he turned to go, but snuck in one last look and saw a woman at her stove, singing again, cooking what looked and smelled for all the world like vegetable soup. Big John snuck down those stairs as quietly and carefully as he could, but as soon as he reached the path by the creek, he ran all the way back to town. 5 miles he ran, and when he showed up at the sheriff's house, he was panting and sweating and pale and just worn out, and his body was just about to give up on him. He knocked on that door. Tap, tap, tap. The sheriff answered. The woman, he said, the cats, he said, the dogs. He told the sheriff what he'd seen, and of course the sheriff didn't believe him about the trapdoor, and he didn't believe him about the vegetable soup, but he believed him about the animal collars. Everyone in town knew that that woman stole pets and livestock, anything with fur or feathers that was small enough to fit in her sack. Everyone knew it, but no one had admitted it, because if they'd admitted it, they would have had to do something. But here was Big John standing at the doorstep of authority, and that authority decided to finally admit to himself what he already knew. It wasn't yet late, just past dinner, and the sheriff rounded up his posse and headed into the forest with guns and lanterns, ready to find the woman and bring her to justice. Big John, though, he stayed at home. He'd used up all his nerve for that night, maybe for the rest of time. Now, this is where you expect this story to go all wrong, and it will, but it doesn't go the way it might have. The sheriff climbed the 37 steps, his posse following. He showed up at the woman's door, banging with the handle of his revolver on the wood. Bang, bang, bang. The woman answered, and the sheriff arrested her, and the posse tore apart the cabin looking for contraband. They found the dog collars and the cat collars, and that was enough. But they found nothing else besides. Hot barley soup on the stove, flavored strong with garlic and wild onion. No bones, no midden, no trap door, no basement at all. Big John had been seeing things. They marched the woman 5 miles back to the sheriff's office and locked her into the town's one holding cell. And by then it was the middle of the night, and the woman was steel-faced and unbroken. You have to feed her, the woman said. Feed who? The sheriff asked. Someone has to feed her, the woman said. Someone must go up there and feed my daughter. You don't have a daughter, the sheriff said. And that was that. The woman was sent to the city for trial, and no one thought much about her again. Because what is a prison but a place to put those you wish to forget, those who make you uncomfortable? What is a prison but oblivion? A week later, Big John was walking home in the evening out along that road when he heard a terrible thing, a wrenching, a scream of wood and steel, and a scream of animal throats and a scream of emptiness and horror. Then nothing. Nothing happened. Except from then on, children from that town, they weren't returned with berry juice on their lips when they went missing. When children went missing, they stayed missing. And now there's a concrete foundation peppered with stones with a crack in it and nothing on the other side. And people don't camp there much, and people don't build towns there no more. And the forest is old, and no one knows how those marble steps got there, and no one knows much of anything anymore. There's no moral to this, to be sure. I'm not here saying that you've got to let the little evils go unaddressed so you don't let out the big evil. I'm not even saying what was in that basement was evil, not for sure. I'm not saying it was right what happened to the woman, and neither am I saying it's okay to steal cats and feed them to monsters. I'm just saying it happened. I'm just telling you about the 37 marble steps and that foundation and that crack that goes off to nowhere.
Remarkable. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you all for listening. I need a breather after that one. There was a lot of tension there. And I think what it seems like is that there is a lot of tension in your works in general. And that tension isn't just the tension of the story happening, but it's tension of sort of how the minds in the story are working and how they're coping with what is happening. Excuse me. For example, in what you just read, it's just the abject truth and reality of something so unable to be understood. And that's the tension in the story. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about those tensions that you play with, both in that story. I know you just read an entire story, but take your time, but and both in that story and in others.
Yeah, I guess when I was like, oh, the theme that runs through all my work is YOLO or whatever, I do think that the other theme that runs through a lot of my work, especially in this, I didn't actually originally set out to write horror. When someone first suggested I write horror, I was like, no, I'm scared of that. I don't fuck with that. Like, I don't really watch horror movies. And people are like, why don't you watch horror movies? I was like, oh, I live in a van. I park in the middle of nowhere and I sleep there. And if I think there's terrible things outside, I remember like years ago, I was like in the Southwest with my ex-boyfriend, and there was this, and we were like driving through Truth and Consequences, New Mexico. And we're like, should we stay here? And I like look it up and it's like the home of the longest running actual serial killer family. I'm like, no, this is not where we will stay. We'll continue driving. And then we park in this like national forest in the middle of nowhere. And my boyfriend looks at me and he goes, do you think skinwalkers are real? And I'm like, no, they're not. Go to bed. And then the next day I'm like, all right, what are skinwalkers? But in the middle of the night, no, none of that shit's allowed to be real. And so I actually started writing horror kind of almost by accident. And the first like consciously horror story I wrote was it's in this, and I don't remember the name of it. It takes place in Baltimore. And it was because I have like sleep paralysis. And so I actually, the other reason is like, I don't fuck with horror is because like I've talked to the devil in the middle of the night because my body wakes up while I'm flooded with paralysis and hallucinations and shit, you know? I like believed in ghosts until I learned what sleep paralysis was. And now I'm, you know, whatever, I believe in sleep paralysis, ghosts are one way or the other, I'm not trying to say. And really depends on where I'm sleeping. There's no ghosts if I'm sleeping anywhere that there might be. And so then I started writing horror. And when I started writing horror, it was also because more of my books were getting called horror, whether I intended them as that or not. Because I tend to think that if you add magic to the real world, you either get like, and that's how the elevators work, or you get like, and there's demons and they walk among us. And you could like, I think the realistic way to depict that is not like happy fun times. I think that when you like, I think power is where most of the horrific things in this world comes from. And so I think that you can personify that into monsters and demons and stuff. And basically what is a wizard but a demon? And so yeah, I guess I ended up really fucking with writing horror at some point unconsciously. And it's less like, it's more like a spooky story, right? It's like a ghost story, and it's not meant to like keep you up, and it was meant to keep me up at night, but that wasn't very hard to do. But yeah.
I think that's really interesting that you're a bit of a scary cat, so am I. But I also am starting to love horror just because of what a tool it can be in storytelling to sort of bring out, you know, a good piece of horror fiction is about human issues. It's about like not just the imaginary things that we're afraid of, but the things in our realities that we're afraid of, or that we're contending with, or the things within ourselves, right? And so, in the story that you just read, while you were reading it, I was reminded of, I used to teach preschool, and children are demons, but also no,
Which means they're all wizards. That's the way that logic works.
no, but there was this one. It reminded me of two childhood stories that I'd never linked before, but it felt like a combination of those. One was, if you know Baba Yaga, the story of Baba Yaga, for anyone who doesn't know, is an old lady who lives in the woods in a house on chicken feed and allegedly eats children. I don't know. I've never met the lady. And then the second story that it reminded me of is called Strega Nona, and it's about. Does anyone know Strega Nona? It's more a little bit more niche, but it's about this old lady who, you know, the whole village leaves her alone and doesn't bother her, but everyone kind of agrees that she's a witch. But the lesson is leave the witch alone, don't mess with her. But then I think it's Big Tim or Big Tom. So when you said,
really?
yes, like big insert
This
some
guy.
guy's name, and this guy's like, "Nah, I'm gonna go get the witch's magic or something," and he goes and then he messes with her magic, including there's like a tip tap. There were a lot of parallels there.
I've never read this.
You should read it. It's
Yeah.
it's funny because it's for kids. It's not actually scary.
Yeah.
But then the town reaps the consequences of we'll call him Big John for the sake of parallel here, of Big John's actions. So that just kind of made me think, to bring it all together, about how horror is as close to the feeling of the lessons in children's stories that I've ever felt.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about, since you talked a little bit about how you kind of accidentally tipped into horror, can you tell a little bit about some of the lessons that you've learned from writing horror and how that has kind of brought out maybe something new in you as a writer as well?
Yeah. Actually, next week's Cool People Did Cool Stuff. I was like, for Halloween, I'm going to do Baba Yaga. I'm going to do fictional person. And then I messed up, so it didn't come out this week, but it's going to come out next week. So I actually just finished like this like obsessive research project about Baba Yaga. So like this week, I know an awful lot about Baba Yaga, but 2 weeks from now, I will not remember any of it.
We'll know something.
Yeah, exactly. Because of the time lag of I research a thing and then it comes out and then people hit me up on social media, be like, what about this one detail that you brought up? I'm like, I don't remember that. That was 3 topics ago. But no, in terms of what I've learned from writing horror, I do think one of the ways that I prefer to interact with horror and the monstrous, and is I really find it. I think like the monster as evil is like boring, and I find and the monster as good is like cool, and I get it, but I really like the monster as neutral. I really like that there are just forces at play in this world that are just not within our system of ethics at all. And I feel like that gets into like, well, when we fuck with the climate, we're all gonna die, right? Not that we would do that, but you know, and it's not because the climate is evil, and it's not because the climate is good. It's just this thing that it's out there, and then if you fuck with it, it'll do terrible things. And that's what I find really interesting, is like these like when I personify nature or personify the witch or whatever, I really like them outside of our system of ethics, because I also really think that I do actually personally believe in ethics very, very strongly, and people developing their own ethical systems. But I also believe that we have to be able to understand people or objects or concepts that are just completely outside of what we consider to be like right and wrong and good and evil. And that's what I like about it. It's boring when the horror movie is like, and then there's the scary thing that just wants to make everyone sad. You know, like, well, we have that. It's capitalism. It's the state, you know. And you know, and then the easy inversion would be like, and therefore all of the demons come help us to overthrow capitalism. Like, they also don't give a shit that direction either. I don't know. That's what I got.
No, I think that's cool. I'm interested too, because you said, you know, the monster as neutral. I really love that, because like you said, you know, if I get mauled by a lion, the lion's not evil. It does suck to get mauled by a lion though.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can talk about sort of where you do find the forces, whether it's good or evil, or just the forces that are in tension with each other in your stories, because it would be, you know, the easiest thing to do would be to make the demons and the witches the bad guys, the big bad. But this isn't Buffy, right? So we're no offense to Buffy, but we're giving we didn't know, but I can say it. This is my bookstore. Fuck Joss Whedon. But but when we're talking about that tension between two different forces, like, how do you draw them out and determine what they are in the story when you're leaving the demon as neutral, so to speak?
I mean, I guess that's like the core thing that I do in storytelling is like set the stage, and then I wind up all the characters, and then I let them go. And like, I think that there's actually a part where someone gets in a fight with a bison in one of these stories. And it, you know, and it's not the bison's fault. That's probably the person's fault. But it's like, yeah, like a mountain lion tries to maul me, I'm gonna fucking fight it. I hope I win. But like in the abstract, I'm not like, the hell with that. Let's get rid of all the mountain lions, you know? And I feel like that's like, once you systemicize, whatever, make things systemic, that's where a lot of like the bad stuff that we come up with, like, let's get rid of all the wolves, or let's get rid of all the mountain lions. Like, that's not gonna have any effects, or whatever. Or even like forest fire, right? Like, we, you know, currently are reaping the benefit, the bad stuff that happened for the fact that we were like, well, we don't like forest fires, so let's stop all of them. And then like that has created worse forest fires and all that. I completely lost my train of, I think you just wind up all the things, and then you know, it's like, if my house is going to burn down, I might fight the forest fire, right? If a mountain lion's trying to eat me, I'm gonna fight it. If a 3-antlered deer is trying to follow me home and murder me, I'm gonna like do what I can to avoid that happening. And I really find those tensions interesting, where people aren't right or wrong, but are in conflict with each other. And I feel like I'm a terrible mediator for my friends. Like, I was like I'm on live stream. I was hanging out with some of my friends, and they were like, didn't like each other at that time. And I would like listen to both sides, and I'm like, yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, no, I see why you're both mad. I don't know. Good luck. I still like both of you, but I get that you don't.
Great casserole though.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for inviting me.
No, I really love that. And fun question for me related to that is, do you play D&D?
I do play D&D.
My senses are tingling.
Yeah.
And so for your fans and for the folks at home, can you tell us a little bit about just this is my little fun I like to throw a fun one in there. How has being a writer influenced? Are you a DM? Do you like to play a character? What do you like to do? And
So I'm really lucky in that I no longer have to DM. I used to always have to DM because the person who wants to play D&D the most is the person who has to be in charge. And eventually I taught one of my friends who's now a way better DM than me. And so now I just like kind of like come along for the ride as a player character. But because I realized the thing that I liked when I was being a DM was less like making sure the players had a good time and more being like, but look, I've built this whole mythology. Or like, yes, but how will the tension of this thing go? Or, you know, and there's that terrible tweet that's like, I just want to DM and control all of my characters. And then, oh, I've been informed that that is called writing a novel.
I was gonna say, I wonder how often you get forced into the DM role as an author. I'm sure that happens a lot.
Yeah, but now I'm very lucky. My friend is a better DM than me. So.
Congrats.
Yeah. Do you DM?
No. Not officially.
Okay.
But so thank you for answering that very silly question. We have a bit more time left, I think. So I'd like to open it up to the floor to everyone here. Lots of folks. Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions for Margaret tonight.
Yeah.
What's your character?
My character's name is Marley. She's a 50-year-old ranger who is absolutely the mom of the party, and is basically just like, and all of her kids are like grown up and off doing work in Waterdeep, and she's just a bandit who discovered her new life of banditry after her husband died. And her dog's name is Rintraw, and I literally named I named my dog after my TV. My co-players were like, "You're doing what?" And I'm like, "No, I really like the name for a dog. I'm gonna use it." Anyone else? Yeah.
Two potential questions. Do you want to talk about Appalachia or do you want to talk about
Appalachia.
Okay, I noticed that a lot of most of your stories are set in Appalachia. Most of them have this very Appalachian vibe. I'm not from there, Florida, so different kind of hell.
I'm from the suburbs of DC, so a third kind of hell.
I wonder, what does that Appalachian vibe? What does that mean to you? Where do you think it comes from? And have you chosen to put it into your stories, or is it more just happened?
So I grew up in Montgomery County, and so I can't really claim that it's an Appalachian area, right? But that was like one of the closest places that would end up or something, right? And going to Harper's Ferry, strong memory. But then more than anything else, I settled in Nashville, North Carolina, and it was when I was traveling a lot, I would go back there a lot. And it's where I ended up spending the most like conscious time interacting in space. And it's where I built a cabin I lived in for a couple of years. Now I moved to West Virginia and live in a different chunk of Appalachian Mountains. And because it's the same overall climate as where I grew up, it like feels right. So it's the place with the most nature that feels the most right to me. And so that is, I think, why I gravitate to that. And I don't know, it was like at some point we started calling like my black metal band, a lot of black metal gets named after, especially atmospheric black metal gets named after the bioregion that it's in. And so we were like, we're Appalachian black metal. And like, what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean banjos, mostly because I don't know how to play a banjo yet. Traditional Appalachian instrument, the accordion, I don't know, whatever. But it's like, when I would walk out of the barn I lived in and see the mist coming up from the creek in the field and watching the deer walk through and stuff, like all of that magic is the stuff that I internalize and therefore end up bringing into my writing. And actually, it's funny, I've tried to set some of the stories in Cascadia. A lot of the stories do take place in Cascadia, but one of them in particular, The Devil Lives Here, the first story, someone at one of the talks was like, you set this in Cascadia, but it feels like Appalachia. And I'm like, You're right. But it's also like, it's also all really complicated by being a white settler, and like I think the way that white settlers interact with Appalachia is inherently going to be different than other people who've interacted with Appalachia. And then like even within that, I'm like also not from there or whatever, but I'm not from somewhere else either. You know, it's a I have a very complicated interaction with place. And so yeah, I don't know. But it's the place I maybe know the most in my guts, so it weaves its way in the most. Yeah.
Yeah, I have sort of a two-pronged question. There's a pie. So in terms of the continuity, I'm wondering if for you, if there's any sense that you are building a sort of mythos to pull from, like, and that is an expansion of itself, regardless of actual like plot incongruities. If that is at all happening on one end, and then secondarily, if there are any overarching continuities, because I don't pay that much attention.
Yeah, the question is kind of whether I'm building a mythos with my work, or like a overarching like folklore or whatever that I draw from. I think that every writer does that to some degree. I didn't start off doing that consciously, but I do find myself drawing the same images over and over again. Sometimes I forget that I've done that. Like the witch paints children's lips with berries, right? And I've used that same image in another story in this, and then also in a music video for one of my old projects. And it's just, I don't know where that comes from, but it's just like an image that I recycle. Partly because when I first started, either no one was paying attention to my work, or I didn't notice that anyone paid attention to my work. So I didn't think anyone would notice if I just started like using the same things. Like, but then it does start. Yeah, it's on some level it's recycling imagery, and sometimes but it's also yeah, creating these things that tie into each other and feed into each other. I can't decide whether or not I'm gonna like try and like timeline much of my stuff together in a more conscious way. I think I'm a little bit too I don't like doing the same thing. There's a reason I have a whole lot of different projects. And so I think it's unlikely that I'll have like a grand overall world that everything will be in, but there will absolutely be elements that recycle. Yeah.
Like, how did you get into politics, and how did you get into like anarchism?
Yeah, the question is how to get into politics and how to get into anarchism. I was a disaffected teenager who didn't know what I cared about politically. And I took this like online quiz in the 90s that the Libertarian Party put up.
Yeah.
And it was like, you're a libertarian. And I was like, well, I like freedom. And so for like a month, I was a libertarian when I was 16. And then my like communist girlfriend who lived in Finland was like, you would know, she doesn't go to this school. And she was like, companies would just run everything if libertarians had their way. I was like, shit, I don't have a counter argument to that. I think you're right. And I still believe that that's true. And so I was like vaguely into the Green Party and social democracy, and like what they had in Finland seemed better than what we had here. And so I was like kind of into that, but it didn't stir anything in me. And then when I lived in New York, my friend was like, you should go to this protest. And I was like, all this protest stuff's silly and it's meaningless, whatever. And they're like, no, I think you'd really like it. And I looked it up, and the anarchists were wearing masks despite the laws that said they weren't allowed to wear masks. The irony here is, actually, I think anarchists do still wear masks more than other people. And so I went to this protest, and I went up to this anarchist, or rather I went up to this person wearing all black with a black mask on. And I was like, hey, what's anarchism? And he was like, well, we hate corporations and the state. And I was like, oh, well, what are you going to do about it? And he was like, well, we're going to build up alternative institutions while attacking the ones that are destroying the world. And I was like, well, do you have an extra mask? And he did. And so on February 2nd, 2002, I started self-identifying as an anarchist. And it's when things came into place for me. It didn't necessarily change what I believed, but I think that, I think ideology can absolutely be a trap, and labels are very dangerous, but I think they can also be a lens by which, if you have all this blurry stuff in front of you, having a lens that allows you to make sense of it is very useful. And people use different ideological lenses to sometimes even come to the same conclusions as each other. But that's what did it for me, and that was 20 years ago now. And my overall concept has not really fundamentally changed since then, even though it's deepened and shifted in a lot of ways. Yeah.
I'm a jaded, burnt out anarchist. What's your advice to solutions to keep going?
Oh Lord. I think one of the things to do is like accept that it's like not everything is going to be frontline, and like it's also totally okay to like sometimes I go to my friends who are just like jaded, burned out anarchists. I'm like, no, it's fine. You're like the reserve troops. It's totally fine. And this is not a weird analogy. It's completely fine. And they're like, okay, that is totally not a weird analogy, and I'm totally on board. And it works every single time. No, and because like when you try to like destroy a mountain by beating your head against it, it's not necessarily the most effective thing. And then you're like, oh, my head's bloody and the mountain's still there. And but I don't know, the more I look at history, which is what you stick around long enough, you just start becoming one of those assholes who cares about anarchist history instead of anarchist practice. But you realize that it's like all this stuff comes in waves, right? And so like holding on to caring, even if you're not necessarily super active. And then the other thing is that what really helped me was when I used to spend all of my time being like a frontline direct action person or whatever. And then eventually I was like, you know what, I'm going to hang out in like the science fiction world and just be an anarchist within that. And then, and that's like done more good. And so I would say that like, without like screaming from the rooftops about your politics, which I probably do a little bit, but I don't intend to do as much as I used to intend to do. Just being in spaces and carrying those ideas about like ways we can treat each other as equals and stuff in those different spaces. I don't know. That's what I got. That's what I'm holding on to. Yeah.
I can quickly second that answer for people who are DC residents. We recently held an event here at Lost City Books called Coffee Not Cops. And we had a really cool collection of anarchist folks doing a lot of coalition building and stuff. So if you want to keep up, just let me know.
Hell yeah. Yeah.
So living in Appalachia now, how do you feel that your being an anarchist, your gender identity and all those other things, how does that tie into, or how is it serving those marginal populations in Appalachia, like cornbread communism, or just trans people up and down the mountain range and things like that, in places that are, every time I go out in the mountains, it's like, okay, am I gonna go back in the closet or am I out? Like basically keeping it from becoming like Arkansas.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot of really good answers. When I lived outside of Asheville, I was very much not closeted, and there was a large enough contingent of people that I felt comfortable with that. And where I live now, my neighbors, I have two neighbors, and they both have made it clear to me that it's totally fine that I'm a gay man. And I have not done anything to dissuade them from this. And I'm like, eventually once I'm gonna go eventually and like, all right, live streamed. My answers change a little bit based on, and so like, and I think the actual answer would have been very different 5 years ago. I think especially the groomer discourse and this like idea that trans women are like sexual predators and stuff has like directly affected like my interactions in rural spaces. Since Trump's election, my interactions with rural spaces have become substantially more tense. As it used to be sort of a like, well, I mean, one of the things that in some ways that I like about rural life is there's kind of this like live and let live of being like, I don't know, everyone does something weird, and unfortunately, I think it's leaving a little bit. However, I also do find that where I live now is not a place of conflict. Asheville is a place of conflict. That's where like, Nazis doxed me. Don't call us Nazis, we're neo-Confederates, is what one of the people who doxed me responded on Twitter. You say potato, I say Nazi, I don't know. And so it's this place of conflict where I was very intense and all the huge truck. I mean, I have a huge truck. But like would have like, you know, Punisher skulls on them or whatever. And where I live now, like I remember, you know, I was like following this pickup truck and I was like, what's that? What's that logo on it? Line X, what's that? I was like, oh, it's a truck bed light. It's a truck bed light. That person's advertising, I like my big truck. And I'm like, you know what? I like my big truck too. And so it's like less a place of conflict, but at the same time, there's also not as much of a community where I live currently. But you know, there used where I lived before, there were a lot of people working on mutual aid projects in the hollers, and like just like a lot of it was like firewood delivery, right? And there's I think I mean basically the answer to like almost every question is mutual aid, and like showing up with the stuff that people need, and you know, and also like having ways that people can feel useful and good, like, you know, it'd be like the neighbor who might not have like totally loved us before is like, oh, you're setting up this firewood delivery program, like I have a huge truck, I can be useful, you know. And it's like, hell yeah, you can. And like bringing people in that way. I don't know, especially I don't know what the hell's going to happen in the next couple of years, you know. I don't know where's going to be safe and where's not going to be safe. Sorry, I think about this question all the time, and I don't have any answers. Let's see if anyone else first. Yeah.
I've got a rambly question because my family from Appalachia.
Cool.
And something that I've worked through through my childhood, do you think that the stories, like the kind of Gothic Southern stories, are kind of a counterpoint to the conservative Christian culture in Appalachia? Because my family is very, very Baptist, but well, Granny, why do you tell us all these stories about witches? And why do you know about these roots and leaves and things?
Mm-hmm.
So do you find that there's that weird section of Appalachia that has not a two-faced, but duality? And that's kind of what brings the stories out in Appalachia. Why we set horror stories or fantasy stories there kind of fits, because people know that word culture is kind of bullshit and we took over from other people, but we're going to make up stories, make us feel better about it.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, first of all, I think Christianity has like a built-in dualism that like, well, I guess it'd be a Trinitarian, whatever. I think that there is this like tension within, in my research and my background is more about the Catholic like thing. There was like literally this thing for hundreds of years in different countries called dual faith, where you know, as Catholicism would colonize different parts of the world, people would continue to believe what they believe, and then just sort of rename it a little bit. And I think that that's true with Christianity more broadly. I know less about like the Southern Baptist stuff and evangelical, and I know those are different, but like I know less about that, but I think that there's always going to be this thing where it's like, I mean, we're still talking about magical systems and we're talking about religion, right? And I don't mean this as a disparaging thing to anyone who's religious, you know, but, and so when people are going to have different ways of doing it, in terms of like Appalachian horror, it is something that I do worry about, because there's this presentation of Appalachia. I think a lot of Appalachian horror is based in classism and is based in this like, you know, that's where the poor people are, and that's where they have weird poor people stuff. And even though I think that a lot of the like folk remedies and things that are part of culture are also a response to poverty in a very beautiful way. I don't know. I actually basically just feel like I'm not informed enough to really engage with that part of Appalachian culture. I think that my stories, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not there yet, you know? So I don't know. I think you would have better answers than I would basically on all this. Anyone else?
Quick one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you ever see yourself going back to one of these stories and expanding it into, say, a novel?
It's not super likely. I have this very strong, as a writer, I had this art teacher when I was in high school who was like really, he painted very quickly, and then he would not go back and like revise paintings, and he would just do it again. And I remember I would go and I hang out, and he's like, you see this painting on my wall? And I like loved it, right? It's beautiful goth painting. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, I sold that painting for $700 and I liked it, so I painted another one because it was just like not precious to him. And and when he would put out music or when he put out a painting, he'd be like, okay, I learned so much and I will do it better next time, but I'm not going to go back and revise this. And so I tend to have this strong iterate rather than revise concept. And so sometimes that even applies on like themes and worlds that I build. But that said, I think a lot of the settings that happen here, I will probably write longer work that takes place in those settings and maybe with those characters, but probably not the story is the first chapter or something like that. Just not because it's like good or bad, it's just the way that my brain works about my creative process. Wait, which one did you think I should do it to?
I mean, you can always hear more about the teenage death cult.
Yeah, that's true. I did Teenage Death Cult. That's almost the story I read pretty well. But you didn't get the Teenage Death Cult. You have to buy it. Which I'd say is available for sale, but there's like 4 that are available for sale. I think they're already sold.
You can order them downstairs if you don't have a copy on reserve. I have time for one more question.
Yeah.
You said that in your fiction, you sort of prefer the characters to, or you're more interested when the characters are dealing with forces that are like completely separate from like their concepts of good and evil and morality. I was wondering if that same sort of perspective is something that like you see reflected in your other work. Like listening to your podcast, that felt really resonant with like the sort of overall I don't know, perspective that you bring that makes them interesting. So I was wondering if you think there's a common thread there.
Yeah. It's funny because in some ways my podcast is in conversation with a different podcast called Behind the Bastards, which is a podcast about bad people. And I was like, what if I make a podcast about good people? And they were like, okay. And then and so then I started doing that. And then I was like, what if all good people are really complicated? And that was something I had to deal with like pretty much right away, because I'd be like, oh, I'm reading about these people, and then they did really good and beautiful things, or were part of really good, beautiful movements, and then also did really terrible things, or in their personal lives were terrible, or made compromises that I wouldn't have when they did the things that they do. And I do think, maybe more than is right, I try to let each person be themselves and let them be complicated good, and I think that does tie into like letting people have a different ethical set than I do, because if I judged everyone by my ethical set, I wouldn't have any friends, and I probably would also be disappointed in myself all the time. And so, and I actually think that this is one of the problems of the left more broadly, is that we have this tendency to focus on the things that separate us, rather than the things that bring us together. But I want to be like really careful when I say that, because I'm also like, it's also totally fine to be critical of people. It's totally fine to be in conversation with people. And I really don't believe that we should all like try to be the same. I think we should just learning to be accepting of difference and different motivations. And so that absolutely ties into my reading of history. I don't remember who it was. The Reverse episode that was this week, Shalom Schwarzbard. It's this like really amazing Jewish assassin who killed the guy responsible for all these pogroms in Ukraine, and like was probably really shitty to his wife. Like not like in all the worst ways that one could imagine that going, right? But like in these ways where you're like, oh, that's not impressive. Like, oh, that's not what we hope for our friends to act like, And I'm like, well, it's like, it's cool that you organized all of the religious and non-religious Jews to defend against pogroms and stuff, And so I'm really interested in how we can like both like sit in judgment and not. Oh God, that's very Catholic of me. Where it's like we can be like, oh, we recognize you're doing this thing, and it's okay, sort of in this complicated way. Yeah, no, that's what I got. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Margaret, for joining us this evening. This is an incredible conversation, and thank you all for participating. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much.
now's your time to mingle and chat as you like. I'm taking, I'm taking the books away. I'm so sorry. If you did not get a chance to get a book, you can always order one at the front desk.
And I can sign any copies if people have them. Plus.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, well, truly, I was my professor.
What if you pre-order?
They, I don't think that's a great